Makeup brushes or sponges, which one should you use? And how do you master blending out your makeup? That's what we're talking about today, so let's get into it.
I could break it down, take it back to the basics.
Today's foundation of choice is going to be the Bear With Me Blur. This is the Blurring Tint Foundation in Nutmeg, and this is from NYX Cosmetics. So I'm gonna just use my finger right now and place the product on my skin. I think I tried this foundation out like once, and I don't fully remember like my thoughts on it. I think the color may have been a little off for me. Right now it looks a little orange, but nonetheless, we gonna see if it's blurring today. So typically for me, I like to place my foundation on my face before I start blending it out. So whether I'm using a brush or my fingers to place the product on my face, I like to go ahead and place it where I want it to be blended out versus like going straight in with my blending brush with the product. I will say, if you want to warm up the product and get it like ready to just melt in the skin, you can put the product on the back of your hand and use your brush or sponge and dip into it to warm the product up before applying it to your face. It's basically like preheating the oven. Like your food's gonna cook either way, but like if you preheat it, it's just gonna melt in a little bit better. So if you want to do that, you can, but nonetheless, I like to place my product directly on the face with my fingers or like a concealer brush just to get it on there. From here, I like to go ahead and buff out the foundation. I do need to wash my brushes like real bad, so don't judge how dirty this brush is. But my favorite brush to blend out foundation is the NYX. This is their buffing brush. And this, if you don't have this brush, get it, period. That's all I need to say. Game changer, holy grail, I love this brush. So when I use my brushes to blend out my foundation, I like to pat and like actually buff it in. So we're doing this motion as we're going in circular. Boom. So we boom, 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 boom. That's what we're doing. We're not swiping it like this. I feel like that leaves streaks in your makeup, but we're also not just straight buffing it because you don't want it to look stippled either. Like you just want to pat in circles and blend it out. So I'm gonna pat in circles. The left half will be brushes, the right half will be sponge. Buff, 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 buff. Now I want to show you guys this in real time so you know like how long it takes me to buff it out. Now I have been doing my makeup for a while now, so I may move slightly quicker than you might, but as you can see, oh, wait a minute. Okay, it's a little darker than my neck, but I don't have on any concealer or nothing like that. But baby, bear with me. This look good. It's blurring too. Hold on, wait a minute, Mr. Postman. Typically, I don't like to apply foundation to my forehead. I just use whatever's left over like on my brush and just pat up there because I feel like it looks less cake face versus if you applied like a dotted foundation on your head and blended it out, because your forehead 9 times out of 10 is already gonna have concealer in the center and contour on the edges, so there's no real reason to like straight up apply foundation on your forehead because you're about to cover with bronzer, concealer, contour anyway. So I just take the leftover from my brush and just blend. And as you can see, like I have more coverage on this side than this side just from using the excess that's left over on the brush. So this is what this side looks like brushed. Now on this side, we're gonna take the sponge, and I do like to use a damp sponge. If you're looking at a sponge like this bottom part is like the butt of the sponge, and then this is the end that I typically use to blend out concealer. I'm gonna take the butt of this sponge and I'm just gonna start blending. Now, when it comes to a sponge, it's more of a beat. This is really where face beat come from, in my opinion. It's gonna take probably a lot longer for me to blend this out, because the downside to sponges is that it absorbs the product, so you may get a more sheer coverage versus a brush. The bristles aren't really absorbing the product, it's more so distributing the product. I do think the sponges allow you for like a seamless blend, but I don't know if you can see. I mean, granted, I didn't color correct like my acne scarring that I have going on. I feel like this side definitely has way more coverage than this side. Even if I use the excess to blend out my forehead, I feel like this side is still giving more coverage. Because I'm gonna give it a fair shot, I'm not gonna apply more foundation to this side. I don't know if you can see up in here my dark marks and scarring peeking through, versus this side is like legit full coverage. So this could work to your advantage. If you want more of a sheer coverage and you want like those imperfections peeking through, then you may want to use a sponge to blend out your foundation. But as for me in my household, I prefer the brush look. Give me coverage. So I did get this bronzer, the Sun Melt Natural Cream Bronzer from Say Beauty. This is in the shade Tan Bronze. When it comes to bronzing or contouring, I actually like to use this brush to blend out like any cream or liquid bronzer. This is actually the Morphe E63 brush. I think it's supposed to be for foundation, which it does work well for foundation, but I just think this angle is great for getting like right up in there. So I am gonna tap into this product, and because it's a cream product, I am gonna like warm it up on the back of my hand. And again, that just helps the product melt into the skin better. So I'm just applying some of that cream bronzer here. I don't even know. Okay, you can see it. And again, I'm doing that same buffing motion. And then I do like to go back in when I'm using my brush and blend out the edges as I'm adding products in, so everything looks like it's flowing and melting together. So that's this side bronze. Ooh, you can tell the difference too. It's giving bronze goddess. Now I'm gonna take again the butt of my sponge, bounce it on the back of my hand to again warm the product up, and then start placing it. When it comes to things like this, I definitely think a brush is better, because it's hard for me. Look how low this is coming. It's hard for me to really control where the product goes by just like beating it into my face with this sponge. Like, it's hard to control where the product is going. Now, there are smaller sponges that you can use and things like that, but again, I still feel like it'll absorb the product, which isn't always a bad thing, and then it'll just spread the product. So now if I wanted to like clean this up with a brush, but I'm using a sponge, I would just go in with another, either a clean sponge or a different part of the sponge to try and clean that up. This is the side with the sponges. Brushes, I just feel like this side is more precise and has a bit more coverage. I do own some like tinier sponges in the event that I like wanted to use it on my nose and contour. Like, that looks nice. And if you get like small sponges, they can be helpful in smaller areas of the face. Typically, if I bronze like the side of my nose, I would use a smaller brush. This is the MAC 270S brush. I literally just picked this brush up any similar compact buffer brush will work. A more affordable version is the mini buffer from Morphe. But again, you can just control where the product goes a lot more, I feel like, with the brush. Like this side is more diffused, a little bit more lighter coverage because the sponge absorbs some of the product. This is definitely more pigmented. For concealer, I've been sticking with my Sephora collection Best Skin Ever concealer in the shade 31Y. So I like my concealer to get tacky just so I can have a fuller coverage like effect. On the brush side, I'm taking my Real Techniques. This is the 308 brush. This is from the Everyday Essentials brush set. I definitely think blending out concealer with a brush is a little more tedious, but it has its pros. It allows you to blend the product precisely. Like it's not gonna run everywhere. Like exactly where I'm patting is where my concealer is dispersing. When I'm using brushes, I go back and forth between brushes to make sure I have a seamless blend. So I went from using the concealer brush to blend out the concealer on this side to using my foundation brush to just kind of diffuse those edges. And then even if I want to go back in with that bronzer brush, just to make it like a nice smooth gradient. I'm not adding any additional product, just using those brushes and the residue on the brushes to kind of like make that a nice gradient. Under the eye, like I said, a brush helps you keep that concealer right where you want it. Like it's not gonna travel too far. It's gonna stay right where you want it. I do think you get fuller coverage under the eyes when you use a brush. But just see how that just, it just do it for me. I love that. As far as sponges that I recommend, because I didn't tell you guys what sponge I was using, I love the e.l.f. little camo sponge, great sponge. Real Techniques also has a great sponge. This one is a little bit more firm and it has the flat side. And then a sponge like this is my Shop Miss A sponge. Shop Miss A have the sponges for the low. And they're great quality, so I definitely recommend trying them. So I'm gonna take my e.l.f. sponge right now and blend out. Again, my sponge is damp. If you use a dry sponge, it's not gonna absorb as much product, but it'll be harsher when you blend it out versus just melting. So as I'm blending out with the sponge, like you see, it just kind of travels on its own because it's harder to control, you know, where the sponge is dispersing the product. It can travel further across your face than you want it to sometimes. Again, I'm doing the same thing. I blended out with this sponge and then I went back in with the butt of the sponge that I used to do the foundation and bronzer with. Now I'm gonna go under the eye. Try to focus on the outside of the concealer, like blending out the edges. Now I will say I do like a sponge to blend under the eye. It's not as harsh when you're as if you were like patting a brush under the eye. I do like that it absorbs product because it helps if you are heavy-handed and you apply too much. Like a sponge will help pick up that excess product. If you want a more sheer coverage look, a sponge may be what you want to try. So as you can see, this side looks a lot more kind of lightweight, natural. This side is giving you more full coverage. So that is brush versus sponge, foundation, bronzer, concealer. Now I also wanted to show you brush versus sponge when it comes to setting powder. For setting powder, I am gonna take my Laura Mercier translucent loose setting powder. This is the Ultra Blur one. Now this isn't drugstore, but it is a holy grail. So if you want to try it out, check out their travel size. It is a lot more affordable than the big one, but definitely worth the investment. For the brush side, I will be taking the Real Techniques. This is the 402 brush. I think this one's from the Everyday Eye Essentials, and this is just from the Everyday Essentials brush set. I'll link both of them in the description box. So when it comes to powder, I like to tap in the powder, then tap off all that excess, because a brush is going to pick up a lot of powder. And then I just start tapping up underneath. Anytime I use a brush to set, I feel like it's more of a lightweight set. And it's just kind of like a little flawless finish, in my opinion. All right, so this is setting with the brush. Now on the other side, I'm gonna just take this Real Technique sponge, just because it don't have no product on it right now. I'm gonna tap it in the flat side, and I'm gonna set under the eye with the sponge. I do think setting with a sponge picks up more product, which in turn, like this would be the basis for an all-day set. I do enjoy setting with a sponge. It's at this point, if I wasn't able to clean up my bronzer with the sponge, that I would do this number right here with the sponge to clean up my bronzer to make sure it didn't go too low. I just feel like when I'm setting with a sponge, I just be going ham, but with a brush, I just be lightweight with it. So obviously, I would dust this off with a brush. Ain't no way me getting around it. So I'm gonna go ahead and dust both sides off, and this is also setting all the other areas where I didn't put setting powder. Just brushing that off. Same thing on this side. I do feel like you gotta put a little bit more elbow grease when you blending out setting powder that you set with a sponge, to make sure you don't have those harsh lines. And what like helps out for me with that is going in with setting spray. All right. So I went ahead and did the rest of my makeup off camera. This is what my face looks like. This is the side that was blended out with a sponge. This is the side that was blended out with a brush. I definitely always feel like the sponge application always comes out, it comes out a little bit more matte. The brush side, I feel like, especially when I set the powder with a brush, like it comes out more luminous, more natural, more radiant. I definitely like to use both brush and sponge. I typically like to do my foundation with a brush, my concealer with a sponge, bronzer with a brush, and my setting powder with a sponge. Or I really enjoy setting my face with a powder puff. The powder puff has been around for years, but I have just been getting hip to it and using it more often than a sponge. So I definitely like going in and setting my under eye with a sponge, especially these like little triangle shaped ones. I just feel like they fit really well right up under the eye. So all in all, both techniques has their pros and their cons. It's totally up to you which technique you prefer to use, what look you like to go for. So it's totally up to you. Choose either brush or sponge, whatever works best for you. Whatever technique makes you feel like your makeup is slayed. Okay, so I hope this video was helpful in helping you decide whether you should try out a brush or a sponge to blend out your makeup. And hopefully I also gave you some tips on the art of blending. So if you're still watching this, you might as well go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future uploads. I love y'all so very much, and y'all never forget, at the end of the day, without regrets, love yourself and be you, Tipple. Bye, y'all.
All about natural beauty. Yeah, slim Reshae.